All right.
I'd like to welcome you all back to the channel. And today we are lucky enough to have with us a very special guest, Austin Templeton. Now, I'm going to have to read this because there's a lot to read. He was born a while ago. Uh, he's an
83
American.
years ago. Yeah, right.
Okay, if you say it first, March 27th, 1940.
That's right.
He's an American actor, a playwright, a theater director, an instructor, and much more. And I always forget. So before I continue, please like and subscribe. Thank you. Now, um, I want to jump in. I have so many thoughts. I watched some videos on you, and I wanted to dazzle you with questions that you're not used to hearing. I don't want to
Okay.
ask you all the old questions.
Okay.
So I just wanted to say that, okay. So first of all, you said you're good with anything. When I wanted to discuss with you to plan how we're going to do this interview, you said you're good with anything. Now, the way I look at interviewing is that when somebody gives me their time, it's a gift. And when somebody says they're good with anything, that's a prize. I mean, that's it means a lot to me. It's very kind. And I want to thank you for that, that you just left the floor for me to decide how to push with this.
Yeah.
So I'm going to jump right in.
Great.
Action hero versus regular character and how their career progresses. Meaning, when you go out there and you hear all these famous names like, Bruce Willis and Sylvester Stallone and Schwarzenegger, um, and then you have somebody such as yourself that is more of an everyday man. You could do, something a little more serious or something a little bit more comedy. Um, do you think that that helps you as your career progresses? For example, you see now Schwarzenegger and Stallone, they're doing a good job, but they're doing this like older man version of a tough guy, just playing off what they did in their younger years. Whereas
Mhm.
you have decades and decades of being able to play all these different sorts of characters. And I would imagine a part of that attributes to the fact that you aren't not typeset as a certain, superhero. What are your thoughts?
Well, fame is something I've always been a little frightened of. I never really wanted big fame. Um, I thought I was afraid I would get trapped in it. And I've seen a lot of very brilliant people I know get trapped in it because the public demands a very specific thing from them and they have to keep delivering that. And I've known a number of people who um, before they got famous, I've known them very well, and then they got famous, and not entirely without exception, but in almost all cases, uh, it got very difficult for them for a while. Then they handled it. Then they settled down. But for a while, it was, I guess, the word. In fact, one of them, Olympia Dukakis, for example, the word that she used when she all of a sudden became quite famous, having had a very stable, interesting career up until then. I think the word she used after she became abruptly famous with Moonstruck, was trapped. And I mean, I'd always been uneasy about the idea of fame anyway, but then I saw when it happened to some of my very best friends who I knew before and after, and all of them did adjust. I mean, but that I've always been scared of fame.
Well, I mean, I, I think you messed up and got famous though.
Yeah, but not that kind of fame.
Right, like you see Stallone can't even leave a restaurant without being haggled, which is something I was going to ask you about. Do you find it easier
And he's a brilliant
to
actor, Stallone.
yes,
I mean, he's
yes,
an extraordinary actor.
yes.
Yeah, yeah,
I didn't mean to minimize his acting abilities. I
yeah.
just feel that there's certain actors that they create the movie around the actor as
Hmm.
opposed to sometimes an actor being able to fall into a part. Like Brad Pitt, I think is very underrated. You could put him in a movie you'd never imagine, and he suits in.
That's absolutely true.
Incredible.
He's been very shrewd about he and his whoever manages him have been very shrewd about how they've shaped his career. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, do you feel like throughout your career you were just being yourself? For example, for those that don't know, and I'm sure everybody does know, I'll pick a couple of famous ones, right? My cousin Vinny,
Yeah.
where you played the stuttering lawyer, which ironically you've dealt with this issue of stuttering, which we'll get back to soon,
Hmm.
and it was hysterical. And then you were in A Beautiful Mind, definitely one of my top five movies. I mean,
Oh, that's a gorgeous movie.
yeah, and you played that part where you got him to come back into that room and they put the pens down and it just feels that even though you're playing different parts, a comedian, a serious guy, but you kind of could flow in it without having to go out of your own character, right?
Well, that's what actors are trained to do.
Be their character.
Yeah, yeah.
I've heard
It's all about, I mean, the major word in that is circumstances. You just surround yourself with the circumstances of the character's life, beginning from where, in my case, he was born, where your character was born. And you surround yourself with how he grew up and what circumstances pressed in on him. And you don't ever stop being you. I mean, first of all, that's physically impossible.
right.
And and but you just keep surrounding yourself with more and more circumstances. Some and parts that are a stretch for you, what they call a stretch, are parts where there's a whole load of circumstances that maybe you've never experienced, but you just surround yourself with those circumstances in the guy's life and act on those, respond to those
Understood.
circumstances. I hope
Yeah.
I'm coherent.
Sorry.
I hope I'm being coherent.
Oh no, totally. Two things that come to mind. I forgot there was one actress that went into character for weeks or months before she took a certain part. And then the one that's most glaring that I think most people are familiar with is when The Shining, when Jack Nicholson would go nuts, his co-star would get scared because he would get into character by start acting like a nut for a few minutes before he would do those scenes like knocking the door down.
Or
So you're talking about a bigger
Shelley Duvall. Yeah, yeah.
Shelley Duvall, yeah, she said she was scared. So I get what you're saying on a larger scale to really own the
I
character.
did a movie with Shelley Duvall once, and
Yes,
we had an all night shoot at one point. This was up. It was shot up in Canada. It was actually set in the village in New York, in a Greenwich Village. And she told me all about The Shining, and she was fascinating about it. It wasn't so much Jack Nicholson; it was Stanley Kubrick. The director. How he. Um,
that's a scary mind to get into.
yeah, right, and how he really, literally, from what she told me, and I believe this. In fact, I already knew this about him before. God, I would have given anything to be in a Stanley Kubrick movie. But she said he literally worked on driving everyone, Jack Nicholson, herself, everybody crazy. And of course he got fantastic results. All of them are brilliant in it. But all of them, well, I know her. She's a very generous actor. And I've always heard that Jack Nicholson's a very generous actor. And so they give themselves over to it and to each other. But the circumstances are pressed in on them by the director or the playwright, in this case, the director, Stanley Kubrick. And um, I'm rambling a bit, but you see my
Not at
point.
all.
It's circumstances.
Not
If
at all.
Austin were in that haunted house up on the hill, like in The Shining, And I was having to deal with all the things that those characters are dealing with. What would I do?
Right.
So, and if there are enough circumstances that are different, then that means it's not just me, it's the character I'm playing.
Right. And that's why I guess they have to have the circumstances with the right personality to get the result they want.
Yeah,
Because
right.
you would come
Yeah.
out different than Jack
Well, the
Nicholson.
circumstances form the personality. If you were lived in those circumstances, you would have a different personality than me. But if I surround myself with those if I enclose myself in those circumstances, then I would be like that.
Understood. Let me ask you a question. What would you say is your favorite theater or movies, acting or teaching? Is there a specific movie that you felt was like your all-time favorite of how you felt you hit it out of the ballpark?
Well,
Because
actually, A Beautiful Mind, I was very proud of. But the amazing thing that day, I was only on it one day. Uh,
really,
the amazing aspect of that day was Russell Crowe. I was up here in Chicago at Steppenwolf, the company that I work with, and I was playing Uncle Vanya, and I could only come down for the Monday, so because that's the day off. And so the first scene, I had three scenes. The first scene was shot at 7 in the morning, and I'm introduced to the character that Russell Crowe played. And he started being very funny. He talked about his uncle in Australia who played Uncle Vanya, and how every time every year, when his uncle would talk about the reviews he got, Russell Crowe said, the reviews seemed to get even better than the last time his uncle described them. So then we had a scene in the middle of the day. Now, A Beautiful Mind won for Best Screenplay Academy Award, and I think it deserved it. But there was one scene in it that I was very much involved with Russell that was unplayable. And I just couldn't get it and couldn't get take after take after take. And we were out in the hot sun on the Princeton campus in June. And Ron Howard would come over and I would say, why is this scene in the movie? Because the Mathematical Society of America would not demanded that this scene be in. I said, well, can it be rewritten? Because this script is so brilliantly written. They said, no, they wrote it. The MSA wrote it. And it was in a scene where I'm explaining to Russell Crowe's character everything he achieved. Well, I don't, my character wouldn't have to explain it. It's the worst scene I've ever been in a movie, in one of the best movies I've ever been in.
that's
So
interesting.
then we got to the evening with putting down the pens on the table. And Russell, they first did a close up from Russell, and it was a very emotional scene for him. And then all evening, then the producer, we told Ron Howard he had to get all the coverage of the pens being put down, which took 4 hours. The camera overhead, the camera on each professor as they came up, camera as each pen being putting down, on the pens being putting in, the close-ups on me in that, and on Russell, and I'm hours and hours. Finally, it's 11 o'clock, and I'm so tired. I thought, and and Russell had a whole long, and Russell was in old man makeup at this point in the summer. And then he had a whole day like that the next day. So they said, we're going to do Austin's close up now. This is at 11 o'clock at the end of the day. And they said, Russell, you can go home. We'll have a stand in, say your lines off camera in Austin. Russell said, no, I'm staying here for Austin. And he played it as fully as he had done at 6 o'clock, 5 hours before, after this long, exhausting day. He wept, everything. And my take you act with certain actors like him, and you can't help but act
Fall
well.
into your role.
Yeah, you just,
Yeah.
I mean, you take it in and you're there. And
They say that about
generosity.
James Gandolfini, that he was so into his roles that the people around him, it made it easier for them to fall into their
Yes,
roles.
right, exactly. But he did, they told him he could go back to the hotel. And, certain actors, he would have had every right to. He had been working since 7 o'clock in the morning. All this because I could only have this one day.
Well,
And he not only did it, but he did it fully. So that's the scene I'm proudest of in any movie, and it's all because of Russell that I've ever acted in. And 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 it's a very simple little scene. It's the one I'm proudest of, and it's all because of Russell Crowe.
all right. Wow. That is something. Um, Now I touched on a little earlier about the stuttering.
Yeah,
Um, Now we met through a friend that you know because you have this commonality, and I most people are not really familiar. They know if a person stutters, but they're not really um, knowledgeable in what it is. Is it a disease? Is it like I mean, you seem to have beaten it or you have it under control.
yeah.
How does somebody beat it? Is it something that you could put your mind to? Like I used to have a friend who he spoke, he would race, and so he knew to think before he let his words out. Is it something like that, or it's a different
Well, I
animal?
had a lot of training. First of all, I went into acting because I seem to get away from it in acting. That's one of the reasons I went into acting. I wasn't always able to get away from it, but I largely did. And
Why is that?
um
You
why
would think it
what?
would be the opposite. You would think the anxiety would pull it out more, right?
No, because you're playing a character and I don't know why. But and this is true of other actors. They they go into it and because it goes away.
That's
Um
something.
and it you're inhabiting the life of the character. A wonderful voice teacher said to me once, Mr. Mark Heller, when we were working, it was the first play I was ever going to do was in rhyme couplets. And so I still was toward the end of my stuttering days. And so that was I mean, rhyme couplets, you can't change any words. It was the part of Tartuffe in Tartuffe. But he said to me, inhale the other actor's line and exhale your line. Or if you have a long speech, just keep inhaling the expression on the other actor's face and exhaling what you say. That's one of the most brilliant notes I've ever had in my life.
So that makes it sound like it's more like a psychological issue.
No, it's a mixture of a psychological and a physical issue. It's a man named Ron Webster did a whole lot of research on it, and by this point I was pretty well completely over it. But I went through a 3-week program that Ron Webster had, and among the people he had totally cleared from that problem was Annie Glenn, the wife of John Glenn, the astronaut, and she'd had a terrible problem. She'd raised children, and Ron Webster was teaching at Hollins, a school for women at that time in Virginia. And one morning when John Glenn was in the Senate, he and Annie were having breakfast, and Ron Webster was being interviewed. And John Glenn said to Annie Glenn, you want to try? She said, well, I got to try everything else. Ron Webster totally rid her of that problem. So then I got to know John and Annie Glenn. And we would they'd come up to New York for some reason or another, and we'd go to restaurants together. She was speaking utterly fluently after 50 years of when he was circling the globe as an astronaut, it was in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. And she couldn't come out on the lawn. All these interviews were there because she basically couldn't talk. But
Wow.
then Ron Webster found a way through this with her in 2 or 3 weeks. And Annie Glenn became a good friend of mine. And she died at the age of 100 over just about a year or two ago. And there was a long obituary about her in the New York Times about how what she'd done after she was no longer afflicted with this problem, um, is that she spent the rest of her life helping other people who had the problem. A
Wow, that's something.
remarkable woman, a totally remarkable woman.
You got to meet some interesting people in your life. You know, um, it's unbelievable. I mean, the length of your career and the different things you've done, it can't be a coincidence. You've had so much success. And, I was watching
And
some of
some
your,
failure, yes, right.
what's that?
And some failure.
I'll get to that. Don't worry. I'm
Okay, all
I'm
right.
not all nice. I'm leading up to that.
Yeah,
Um, my thing is like this, right? So I was watching some of your interviews, and somebody said to you, "So what have you learned from theater that you can apply to real life?" And you said nothing, and you started laughing. And I thought that was very funny. Um, but what I wanted to say was that the other way around, you've been around a long time, you know, and you've seen the world change. You've seen modern technology come in. This Zoom thing, imagine this 60 years
yeah,
ago.
right. Yeah, right.
And I'm assuming that you've had a lot of success, but you must have had some failures.
Oh, yeah.
And my question to you is like this, you know, you're a really nice guy. I see that. I mean, even in this interview, people can see you shy away from offending or insulting everyone. You have a good heart, but not a but on you. But when you have a career and you know that you had to work hard and you have to have thick skin, how do you deal with the people that intrinsically are not trying hard enough, and they come to you and they're like, how do I make it? How come I'm not making it? And you know that they're not taking their failures the right way, they're not pushing their edges. How is it possible to live a life of kindness where you can always, be understanding of the other person when you yourself have worked so hard to get what you've gotten? Is that a fair question?
Well, the answer is one word: breathing.
I breathe
Breathing.
all the time. Maybe I'm not
Yeah,
breathing right.
breathing. Yeah. You tell them to breathe because when I've gotten in trouble in the past, well, as I told you what Mark Zeller said,
About what?
about that man said, inhale. That vocal teacher Mark Zeller,
Oh,
who I
yes, yes,
who I told you about a minute ago. Just
yes, yes.
I tell them what he told me. Just breathe, and not only to help your stuttering, but also just in life, this business. If you just breathe and you inhale the failure, you inhale the frustration, and you just exhale and sort of an okay.
Right,
That's um but one thing that, see, what happens, a person starts to stutter. It usually happens it happened to me when I was about 7 or 8 years old. And then it was bad. And then it got really bad in my teen years. And then I came into New York, and ironically, the first part I ever had in play was a character who stuttered, which I don't recommend. I mean, it's different with my cousin Vinny because it's shooting a movie and you shoot a few takes and then they have it. But the play I was in, Oh Dad, Poor Dad, Mama's Hung You in the Closet and I'm Feeling So Sad, I played it for a year and it got impossible to control it. It was like a nightmare. The director was, Jerome Robbins. You know who that is?
I'm not familiar. Sorry.
He
I will
conceived
definitely look it up.
he conceived the musical called West Side Story.
Okay,
That
okay.
was his idea. He was a brilliant choreographer and director of musicals. And he directed Oh Dad, Poor Dad. And then he directed me in Fiddler on the Roof. Now you've heard of Fiddler on the Roof, right?
Of course.
Yeah, right. And he was aware of my stuttering, and he was very encouraging. And oh, Dad, I had trouble with it because the character stuttered, and it was like falling into a trap. By the time we got to Fiddler on the Roof, I was pretty well out of it. Not completely, but pretty well out of it. But it was much less, and it kind of worked for the character, the Taylor, and all that. And he was always encouraging to me. And then after that, he Jerome Robbins. He was one of the giants of the theater. He came to see almost every show I was in after that, even the showcases. And then he died. He passed 10 or more years ago. And he, um, um, and he was one of the giants. There's no other way of putting it. Um,
It
and
must
I
have made you feel really good.
and
That's all
and a
coming from
woman named Amanda Vale wrote a biography of him, and she interviewed me a lot. And then I was reading her book one night a few years ago, about to fall asleep, and I was reading about his young years. He stuttered as
really.
a kid. That's why he took such an interest in me. Not the only reason, but I mean because he enjoyed my acting. But how amazing that is. The thing that I thought would halt my career actually through Jerry Robbins advanced it.
I see what you're saying.
You see what I'm
You
saying?
never know.
Yeah. Again, breathing. Just breathe in the disappointments and then exhale. Breathe in the successes and then exhale. It's very important that you exhale after you breathe in the successes, because taking the successes too seriously, it's going to get you in deep, deep trouble.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow. So basically, the lesson is that you don't know where your blessing is going to come from, and that the weakness are sometimes the angles that pushed you through the door.
Well, yeah, instead of the weakness, it's better to call them the vulnerabilities.
Okay,
Because
thank
the
you.
core of acting is you have to be vulnerable.
That's true.
You have to be, or you can't experience what your character experiences.
Right.
And yeah,
No, I was just gonna say I grew up, when Van Damme was big, when I was a kid. I was a big fan of, Jean-Claude Van Damme. And I was always into these fight movies, and I always found it interesting how no matter how good the fighter was, he had to lose if that's what the script wrote. And since violence, is the ultimate show of, alpha aggression, it's interesting that a guy's willing to lose in front of millions of people. Talk
yeah,
about vulnerability.
yeah,
You got to do what it says.
yeah.
Don't have a
That's
movie.
absolutely, yeah. That's the heart of acting. It's also the heart of directing. It's also the heart of writing. It's also the heart of teaching.
So if you
You
were to give two lessons to the viewers, it would be breathe and be vulnerable.
well, if you really breathe, the vulnerability comes along with it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much. I really truly appreciate. Um, I had so many questions, but the truth is you're so expressive. You swallowed in the answers to the other stuff along the way. So you did me a favor.
Oh,
I just it, I just want to end off. I got one more question. If
sure.
somebody wanted to succeed in life,
Yeah.
they want to become a famous actor. They want to become successful in family life and wealth, in whatever. What would you what would you give as a piece of advice? Or is it along the same
Well,
path?
I'll tell you, there was a very famous director for many years named Gene Saks. He started as an actor. He was married to Beatrice Arthur, and And I got to know him having been in Fiddler on the Roof because Beatrice Arthur was in Fiddler, and you know who she was.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Um, and so when I was starting directing, I said to Gene Saks, give me advice about what do you do? What should you do when you're a director? He said, listen, listen. That one word. That's so that's the advice I give.
You can't learn if you're busy talking.
Yeah, right, right, exactly. And when
Yes.
I get in trouble, and I think when a lot of people get in trouble is when we stop listening.
Yeah. And I like the fact that you give so much credit to these actors. I mean, Russell Crowe to me, yeah, he blows me away. I agree with you. And I love that they gave him this absurd movie, Road Rage, because it was so out of his regular typecast that he got an opportunity to just see him just do, even though it was like it was a nonsense movie, but it
Yeah.
was great to see him do something different.
Well, a
But
great actor is a great actor, no matter
right.
what movie or
Oh,
play.
he was all the way on that one. But
Yeah,
what I always thought ever since I was a kid, I always used to think actors must be geniuses because how do they know everything? Like, how do they know my full scope of feelings?
yeah. I had three great acting teachers: Uta Hagen, Herbert Berghoff, and Robert Lewis.
Mhm.
And the mantra of Robert Lewis, he was also a Broadway director and everything, and he acted, but the mantra of Bobby Lewis was talking and listening in acting. He said, if you can be doing the most deep emotional work in the world. You can be have the most wonderful understanding of the text, what the text is doing, the deep. But if you're not talking and listening, and I believe this is a quote, it all goes down the toilet.
That
Talking,
makes sense.
listening, that's the core of acting.
Yeah, and I think it's the
You
core
might
of
say
everything.
it's the core of life.
Yes, yes. I think that in dating, I used to have a dating site and I was involved in all that. And I found that a lot of the flaw men would make is they're busy trying to talk at the wrong time. When
Yeah.
there's a skill to everything,
And we all do that. I still do that sometimes.
right?
And
Right,
then
of
a
course.
voice in my head says, shut up. I was going to introduce another word there. Shut up, Austin. Shut up. Sometimes that advice comes a little too late in my head.
Yeah, but that's part of life.
Yeah.
You try to catch up on things you should have thought of ahead of time.
Yeah.
So so basically the key is to breathe and to listen. I'll
Yeah.
work on
And
that.
the two are the same thing.
So it's all the same thing. The vulnerability, the listening, the
And the
breathing.
breathing, it's all one package.
It's
Yeah.
just like a frame of mind where you're accepting of this like
Or yeah,
higher strength.
another word for it is taking the other person in, taking them in.
Right. Totally, totally get it.
Yeah.
That's
That
fascinating.
was a
Thank you.
phrase that the other of the three acting teachers I mentioned was always in. Uta Hagen. You know who that was?
Who's that?
Uta Hagen. She
I
was a
don't
great.
think
Oh,
so.
she's written books about acting. She taught for years and years. She originated the leading role in the play "Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf." She's a great artist. And I studied with her, and then she and her husband Herbert invited me to start to teach there, and that's where I teach now, HB Studio. Um, but she was always about taking the other person in and allowing, these are her words, allowing them to trigger what you say and what you do. If you don't take the other person in, then it doesn't get to trigger what you do, and therefore what you do is not authentic.
I got you.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so, so much.
Yes,
I
thank you.
truly appreciate your time.
Well,
It
Ari,
was
it's
it was a real
fine.
pleasure having you on here.
Okay.
Fascinating.
Anytime.
Thank you so, so much. God bless you.
You too, Ari. You too. Have a
Thank you.
fine day.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye bye.